No contractor, agency inspector, or wire user representative was scheduled to set foot on the former logging yard outside Castle Rock, Washington, the site locals still call Camp 9, on September 3, 2025. A security camera mounted on the perimeter fence recorded someone there anyway. The camera is part of a monitoring system installed at the site as a condition of its status under Washington's Model Toxics Control Act, the state law governing contaminated properties. It runs continuously, motion-triggered, feeding a retention log that gets pulled and cross-checked against the site's official visitor record roughly once a quarter. What makes this particular clip worth pulling from that quarterly review is the mismatch. A single vehicle enters through the unlocked access gate, parks near the old locomotive shop foundation, and a person on foot spends 11 minutes moving between two specific points on the property before leaving. Nobody has ever claimed the visit. Picture the yard at that hour. September dusk settling early under cloud cover, typical for this stretch of the lower Cowlitz Valley, the old rail grade still visible under grass that hasn't been mowed on a fixed schedule in years, the foundation slab of the motor shop cracked and dark against the surrounding field. This was not a scheduled groundwater sampling visit. Those follow a fixed quarterly rotation, always logged in advance, always with a specific technician's name attached before the truck ever reaches the gate. It was not a trespasser cutting through either. The person on camera moved with clear intent between two fixed points rather than wandering, and left without disturbing the perimeter fencing anywhere else on the property. And it was not a wire user or ecology vehicle already cleared for site access. The plate visible in one frame does not match any vehicle registered to a contractor with standing site authorization. The detail nobody on the review side has been able to explain away is the log itself. Every scheduled visit to this site is recorded in advance, cross-referenced, and filed before it happens. This one isn't on that list, and it isn't the only one. 4 more unscheduled visits, going back 3 years, follow the same pattern. The same 2 points on the property, never the same vehicle twice, never claimed by anyone afterward. Where that fence line sits matters as much as what crossed it. The property operated for decades as an industrial support yard for Weyerhaeuser's logging operations in this part of southwest Washington. Rail maintenance, equipment storage and repair, and a firefighting support function tied to the company's timberland to the east. Carbon tetrachloride was used as a degreasing solvent in the site's electric motor and locomotive shop until the mid-1960s, a routine industrial practice at the time, and one that left no record of concern in any surviving company document from that era. That changed in 2008, when a formal site hazard assessment conducted for Washington's Department of Ecology confirmed groundwater contamination at the property, linked directly to those decades of solvent use. The site was entered into the state's standard cleanup program under the Model Toxics Control Act. As of the most recent public record, no active remediation has been undertaken. The contamination is confirmed. The cleanup has not started. Locals in the lower Cowlitz Valley have called the property Camp 9 for longer than most of them can date precisely. A holdover from Weyerhaeuser's old practice of numbering its logging support camps rather than naming them, the kind of informal label that outlives the company records that would confirm exactly when it started. That name has never appeared on an official ecology document. It appears on maps drawn by hand and in conversations at the diner in town, which is a different kind of durability. It would be easy to assume a site with no active cleanup work simply sits unwatched, camera or no camera. That explanation survives a glance at a program summary. It does not survive the Model Toxics Control Act's own institutional control requirements, which mandate exactly this kind of ongoing monitoring, fencing, signage, and surveillance, specifically because contamination confirmed but not yet remediated still has to be kept contained and kept away from casual public access. Regardless of how far off an active cleanup start date sits, It would also be easy to assume the unscheduled visits are simply undocumented routine work. A contractor who forgot to log a stop, a state employee running an informal check between official rounds. Washington's Department of Ecology requires periodic reviews of sites under institutional control roughly every 5 years, and Weyerhaeuser's own consultants conduct annual performance monitoring under separate agreements at comparable sites in the state. None of those cycles produces a visit every 7 to 9 months to the same 2 fixed points on a property by 5 different vehicles, none of them cleared for site access on any list Ecology or Weyerhaeuser maintains. The property itself covers a modest footprint by the standard of the surrounding region, a few dozen acres, set against the roughly 20,000 acres of company timberland it once served. But it sits inside a county still shaped by a single, well-documented catastrophe. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, whose lahars reworked the Toutle River drainage a short distance from this exact site and buried infrastructure across the valley under material some of which has never been fully removed. Understanding exactly how this site is monitored and why 5 unscheduled visits eventually landed on the same desk matters before anything else about this file makes sense. Oversight of the property is split between Washington's Department of Ecology, which enforces the cleanup order, and a contracted environmental consulting firm that Weyerhaeuser retains to handle scheduled sampling and site maintenance. Neither party runs the camera system day to day. It operates on its own retention cycle, reviewed on a quarterly basis by whichever party requests the footage, usually only when something on the visitor log doesn't reconcile. Nobody involved in that quarterly review process came to the file looking for a mystery. Most quarters, the footage confirms exactly what the visitor log already says and gets archived without comment. The camera itself was installed as part of the site's institutional controls following the 2008 hazard assessment, mounted on the perimeter fence with a fixed field of view covering the main access gate and a portion of the old rail grade, running on solar power with a cellular backup for remote retrieval, the kind of setup standard at contaminated sites, where a technician can't justify a weekly physical visit just to check on things. The system was chosen specifically for its low maintenance burden, not for any expectation it would need to resolve anything more complicated than confirming a gate stayed shut. For most of its operating life, the system logged exactly what it was built to log: quarterly sampling visits, the occasional ecology inspector, deer and coyotes crossing the open grade at dusk. That was the pattern for years, unremarkable enough that nobody reviewed the footage more closely than the quarterly pull required, and no single quarter's footage ever raised a question on its own. The first unscheduled visit wasn't flagged as unusual on its own. It was only during a routine 5-year institutional control review, when a consultant cross-referenced 3 years of visitor logs against the full camera archive as part of a standard compliance check, that the pattern became visible. 5 visits, spaced roughly 7 to 9 months apart, none matching any name, vehicle, or agency on the official access list. What that review eventually cataloged amounts to its own inventory, built the way any flag discrepancy in this kind of compliance file gets built once someone runs the full cross-reference. The visit timestamps, 5 occurrences across 3 years, evenly enough spaced to suggest routine rather than random opportunity. The vehicle plates, 5 different plates across 5 visits, none registered to Weyerhaeuser, its consulting firm, or Ecology, and none returning a match in available public vehicle records. The movement pattern. In every documented visit, the person on foot moves between the same 2 points, the motor shop foundation and a section of rail grade roughly 90 meters east of it, and nowhere else on the property in any of the 5 clips. The duration, between 9 and 14 minutes each time, consistently too short for any sampling procedure on record for this site, and too long for a simple drive-through look. The access method, the same unlocked gate every time, never a cut fence, never forced entry, despite the property being posted and fenced along its full perimeter. And the equipment carried. In 3 of the 5 clips, the visitor is seen carrying a small case or bag of a size and shape the review team could not match to any standard sampling kit used by the site's own contractors. And visits like this one, showing up on camera without ever appearing on the paperwork that's supposed to account for every authorized entry, surface out of monitored sites like this more often than most people watching this would expect. Subscribing with notifications on is the only way to know when the next one gets reviewed and released. Now, back to that fence line outside Castle Rock. No investigation followed beyond the internal review, because nothing at the site had been disturbed in any way that violated the institutional controls themselves. No fence cut, no cap breached, no sampling equipment tampered with, nothing that crossed the threshold for a formal enforcement referral. What did follow was a comparison against the 2 nearest comparable cleanup sites in the county, both under similar camera-based institutional controls. Neither logged anything resembling this pattern in the same 3-year window. Washington's Department of Ecology states its position on institutional control sites plainly, and this file doesn't sit outside that framework. Under the Model Toxics Control Act, a site with confirmed contamination and no completed remediation remains subject to fencing, signage, and monitoring requirements specifically to prevent uncontrolled access. And the agency's own guidance is explicit that periodic review exists to confirm those controls are still functioning, not to explain every individual entry logged on a camera. No completed enforcement action or citation has been issued against any unidentified visitor to this property because no violation of the site's physical controls has ever been documented in any of the 5 visits. That framework explains why 5 unclaimed visits didn't trigger a formal investigation. It does not explain why the same 2 points on the property, and no others, keep drawing return visits from vehicles that were never cleared to be there. One point about this file requires complete transparency, stated exactly where it belongs and not folded into a footnote. The name Camp 9 itself is an unofficial, community-sourced label. It does not appear on any ecology cleanup document, any wire user corporate record reviewed for this file, or any county assessment. It survives only in local usage, the way plenty of old company camp names in this region do, passed down informally rather than recorded anywhere official, and it deserves to be treated exactly that way. A name locals apply, not a name any institutional record confirms. Attached to almost any other contaminated industrial site, 5 unclaimed camera visits over 3 years wouldn't draw a second look. But this property already carried a documented history into the review. In the mid-1960s, solvent use at the motor shop introduced the contamination that would later be confirmed. In 2008, that contamination was formally documented, and the site entered the state cleanup program under a site hazard assessment that has never been superseded by a completed cleanup action. In the years since, institutional controls have kept the property fenced, monitored, and, on paper, accounted for, while the 2 specific points these unscheduled visits keep returning to remain on the site's own environmental maps, unremediated ground. A site that keeps drawing unexplained return visits to the exact 2 points still carrying its original unaddressed contamination stops, reading as random trespass. It starts reading like whoever is visiting already knows precisely where the site's unfinished business is, in a level of detail that isn't available on any public document describing this property. That pattern is not confined to history. The site remains an open case under Washington's cleanup program as of this file, with no remediation start date on record, and the camera system remains active, still logging whatever crosses that gate next, on the same quarterly review cycle that surfaced this pattern in the first place. Set against the broader landscape of institutional control sites across the state, this level of unexplained visitor activity is not typical. Washington's Department of Ecology oversees hundreds of properties under similar controls, the large majority of which log nothing more unusual than scheduled sampling crews and the occasional wildlife crossing for years at a stretch. A site producing 5 unclaimed, precisely targeted visits inside a 3-year window sits well outside that baseline, which is part of why the pattern survived a routine compliance review instead of being written off as an artifact of a busy rural property. None of the 5 visitors has ever been approached, cited, or identified. The site's institutional controls are built around preventing physical harm from the contamination itself, not around identifying every person who walks the property line, and the consulting firm that manages routine oversight has no legal mandate to pursue an identity behind a face on a security clip when nothing has been damaged or removed. Contaminated industrial sites elsewhere have documented similar unexplained visitor patterns tied to their unresolved status. Superfund and state cleanup properties across the Pacific Northwest, several still awaiting remediation decades after confirmed contamination, have logged comparable unscheduled camera activity concentrated specifically around unremediated hotspots rather than distributed randomly across a site, a pattern environmental consultants attribute, when they discuss it at all, to a mix of curiosity seekers, former employees, and occasionally unauthorized informal testing by parties with no standing in the official process. The architecture is the same: a documented hazard, a site under formal but incomplete institutional control, and visits that cluster on the ground that still matters most decades after the paperwork first flagged it. Nothing that follows is established as fact. It is the only account these 5 visits and the site's own records actually support, and no more than that. One reading of the file places it like this: someone with prior knowledge of exactly where the old motor shop's contamination originates, a former employee, a family member of one, or simply someone who worked the rail grade before the camp closed, returning periodically to the same 2 points on foot, briefly, for reasons the footage itself never states, and the visitor never explains to anyone still monitoring the property, then leaving the way they came in, through a gate nobody ever bothered to lock against exactly this kind of visit. The physical record doesn't move once the theories are set aside. 5 visits, 3 years, 1 unlocked gate, 2 fixed points on the property, 5 different vehicles, and a contamination record confirming those exact 2 points as the site's original, still unaddressed hazard. None of it has been reconciled with the official visitor log this site's institutional controls are supposed to keep complete. This channel does not claim to know who has been returning to Camp 9, and it will not pretend Washington's Department of Ecology knows either. An unlogged visit is not a confirmed identity, and a repeated pattern is not a confession. What the record shows is what the record shows, and where the record stops, this account stops with it. Files like this one, an institutional record with a gap its own camera keeps documenting, surface out of monitored contamination sites more often than most people expect, and most of them start exactly the way this one did, as a routine periodic review that turned up a name nobody could match to a name on the list. If you know of a case that belongs in this archive, the comments are usually where it starts. The camera is still mounted on that same fence line outside Castle Rock, still running on its solar charge, still logging whatever comes through that gate. The next scheduled review is in the spring. The frame ends. Camp 9 is still on nobody's cleanup calendar, and somebody keeps checking on it anyway.